Forget Hollywood's glossy blockbusters and polished studio classics. The 1960s were crawling with bizarre little films shot in back alleys, rented warehouses, and rundown motels. These weren't art pieces, they were raw, fast, and built to shock or confuse just enough to sell tickets. Ever wonder what was really playing in those sticky-floored drive-ins when the sun went down? Stick around, because we're about to dig up the strangest and most outrageous B-movies the 60s tried to bury. The Sadist, 1963. It starts with a car breaking down on a lonely desert road, which sounds like the setup for every forgettable B-movie. But then enters Arch Hall Jr. with a snub-nosed pistol and a maniac grin. This cheap black-and-white thriller was inspired by real-life spree killer Charles Starkweather, and what it lacked in budget, it made up for in sheer intensity. Hall plays a deranged young man holding 3 unlucky travelers hostage at a junkyard, and the tension is unbearable from the first gunshot to the final desperate standoff. Director James Landis shot it on scraps of money, using the harsh California desert heat to his advantage. You can practically feel the sweat dripping off the terrified characters. Hall, who looked more like a pop singer than a psychopath, shocked audiences with his unhinged performance. His sneering, wild-eyed persona was so convincing, people assumed he'd never act again after this because he'd scared off every casting agent in town. Critics barely noticed it back then, but Grindhouse fans did. The Sadist became a whispered legend among drive-in crowds. It didn't have gore, it didn't need it. The raw atmosphere and sense of real danger made it scarier than half the horror films of its time. Today, it feels like a forgotten ancestor of hostage thrillers, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and even Natural-Born Killers. Proof that sometimes the cheapest films deliver the sharpest punch. Carnival of Souls, 1962. Imagine a church organist wandering through a world that doesn't quite feel real, where people don't answer when she speaks and pale-faced figures lurk in the shadows. That's Carnival of Souls, a film shot by a group of industrial filmmakers from Kansas who decided to try their hand at horror. Made on a shoestring and filmed partly in an abandoned amusement park, this eerie little ghost story bombed on release, only to be rediscovered decades later as a cult masterpiece. Directed by Herc Harvey, who also plays the ghostly figure stalking the heroine, the film's dreamlike style made it stand apart from its era's more traditional horror. Candice Hilligoss, the lead actress, carries the movie with her uneasy, detached performance, drifting through scenes as if she's half alive and half somewhere else. The carnival itself, with its broken rides and crumbling dance halls, is the perfect backdrop for a story about limbo, loneliness, and things better left unsaid. Critics didn't know what to do with it. Some dismissed it as amateur junk, others ignored it completely. But film students and late-night TV reruns brought it back from the dead in the 1970s. Today, you can see its fingerprints all over horror classics. George Romero cited it as an influence on Night of the Living Dead, and David Lynch practically built a career out of the same eerie atmosphere. Carnival of Souls is proof that even the quietest, cheapest film can echo for generations. The Flesheaters, 1964, this one wastes no time. A group of beatniks and a washed-up actress crash land on a remote island, only to discover the water is crawling with microscopic creatures that devour human flesh. Directed by Jack Curtis, The Flesh Eaters is often considered the very first gore film, long before Herschel Gordon Lewis was drenching the screen in red corn syrup. What makes it memorable isn't just the guts, but the sheer inventiveness of its low budget. The so-called monsters were just animated dots on film, but when they started chewing through victims' skin, audiences cringed hard. One scene in particular, involving a man dissolving into a pile of bones, became infamous among drive-in regulars. The movie also has one of the most bizarre villains of the decade, a mad Nazi scientist hiding out on the island, secretly feeding people to the creatures in his experiments. Shot with limited equipment and financed almost entirely on hope, it somehow pushed boundaries of what audiences could stomach in 1964. Of course, censors hated it. Some theaters refused to book it, calling it indecent. But it kept popping up in grindhouse double bills, making back far more than its tiny budget. The Flesh Eaters may look laughably cheap now, but at the time, it proved one thing. Sometimes the most effective scares come from ideas so wild, no studio would ever dare touch them. Spiderbaby 1967, Lon Chaney Jr., the fading legend of horror, found himself in this bizarre little black comedy that feels like a bridge between the old Universal monsters and the madness of 1970s exploitation. In Spiderbaby, he plays a loyal caretaker for a family cursed with a strange disease that makes them regress mentally as they age. The grown-up children behave like murderous toddlers, trapping and killing unlucky visitors in their decaying mansion. Director Jack Hill shot it in under 2 weeks on a minuscule budget, but he filled it with style, tension, and dark humor. The family members, especially the wild-eyed sisters, became unforgettable images of horror fans' nightmares. Chaney, who had struggled with alcoholism and a career on the decline, gave one of his most haunting late performances. His mix of sadness and devotion to the doomed family gave the film surprising emotional weight. At the time, Spiderbaby barely made it to theaters. Distributors didn't know how to market it, and audiences who did stumble across it were left stunned. 2. Weird to be mainstream and too polished to be pure trash, it slipped through the cracks until being rediscovered years later by horror aficionados. Today, it's seen as a hidden classic, influencing everything from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre to Rob Zombie's House of 1,000 Corpses. Spiderbaby was too strange to succeed in its own time, but decades later, it feels like it was simply waiting for the world to catch up. The incredibly strange creatures who stopped living and became mixed-up zombies. 1964. Yes, that is the actual title, and no, it wasn't a parody. Directed by Ray Dennis Steckler, this is the kind of movie that makes you wonder how it ever got made, and then you realize that's exactly why it became legendary. Shot in California on a budget that barely bought film stock, it mashes together musical numbers, carnival rides, hypnosis, and disfigured killers in one chaotic package. The so-called zombies aren't the flesh-eating type. They're carnival goers turned into deformed servants by a fortune teller who hypnotizes unlucky customers. In between, there are extended dance sequences, characters wandering aimlessly through amusement park rides, and an ending that feels like it was stitched together on the spot. Critics roasted it. One even called it the worst film ever made, long before Plan 9 from Outer Space stole that crown. Drive-in audiences, however, couldn't resist the outrageous title. Posters screamed about it being the first monster musical, and that was enough to sell tickets. Ray Dennis Steckler himself played the lead under the name Cash Flag, proving once again that B-movie directors loved hiding behind goofy aliases. While the film barely scraped by financially, its reputation only grew over time. Today, it's a cult treasure, often screened at midnight festivals where audiences cheer at its sheer madness. If you ever wanted a crash course in how far drive-in films would go just to stand out, this one is Exhibit A. It's not good in any traditional sense, but unforgettable? Absolutely. Night Tide, 1961. Before Dennis Hopper was writing with Peter Fonda in Easy Rider, he starred in this moody, low-budget oddity about love, obsession, and maybe mermaids. In Night Tide, Hopper plays a lonely sailor who falls for a mysterious carnival performer who claims to be part of a family of sea people. She swears that when the full moon comes, she'll be compelled to drown him. Sounds ridiculous, but the film plays it straight, and it works. Shot around Venice Beach, the boardwalk itself becomes a character, neon lights flickering over broken rides, waves crashing against deserted piers. Director Curtis Harrington was part of the avant-garde scene and used that influence to make this feel less like a horror movie and more like a waking dream. You're never sure if the girl really is a supernatural creature or if Hopper is simply losing his grip on reality. When it came out, it barely got attention, written off as too weird and too small. But years later, it found a second life. Film students praised its surreal style, and horror fans called it a lost gem. Hopper himself always remembered it fondly, even as his career exploded in the late 60s. Night Tide is one of those films that shows just how inventive the B-movie world could be. Without big budgets, they leaned on atmosphere, tension, and strangeness. If you watch it today, it feels like a preview of David Lynch's style decades later. Quiet, eerie, and slightly unhinged, it's the kind of film that gets under your skin without ever raising its voice. The Undertaker and His Pals, 1966. If you ever wondered what would happen if a horror movie turned into a dark comedy about small business marketing, this one has the answer. The Undertaker and His Pals tells the story of two funeral parlor owners who realize they can make more money if they create their own customers. So they start killing random people and then profiting off their funerals. It's as tasteless as it sounds, and audiences loved it. Shot on a shoestring in Los Angeles, the film leans into its cheapness with over-the-top gore effects that are closer to parody than horror. Victims are carved up in absurd ways, with one scene involving a chainsaw attack that looks more like slapstick than splatter. The killers, meanwhile, treat the whole thing like an everyday business venture, which makes it both grim and darkly funny. Censors, of course, weren't amused. Several cities tried to ban it outright, calling it offensive and indecent. But on the grindhouse circuit, the controversy only boosted ticket sales. College students in particular latched onto its twisted sense of humor, making it a late-night staple. What makes it stand out today is just how far ahead of its time it was. Long before films like Eating Raoul or Delicatessen mixed cannibalism with comedy, The Undertaker and His Pals was already there, skewering American consumerism in the crudest way possible. It's ridiculous, gory, and not remotely scary, but it's one of the most unforgettable B-movies of the 1960s. The Horror of Party Beach, 1964. Now we're talking pure drive-in cheese. The Horror of Party Beach tried to cash in on two things at once: beach party musicals and monster flicks. The result? Bikini-clad teens dancing to rock and roll, suddenly interrupted by radioactive sea creatures that look like potato sacks with fangs. If Ed Wood had directed a surf movie, it might have looked like this. Filmed in Connecticut, of all places, the movie was pitched as the first horror monster musical. A rock band actually plays live on the beach while chaos unfolds, and yes, there are dance numbers between monster attacks. The creatures themselves are hilariously cheap, with rubber suits and googly eyes that made even 1960s audiences laugh. Critics destroyed it. The New York Times called it one of the worst films ever released. But teenagers didn't care. It became a hit at drive-ins, thanks in part to the soundtrack and the sheer weirdness of its mashup premise. Today, it's regularly included in So Bad It's Good marathons, often paired with other creature features of the era. What's wild is that the film has actually been preserved in film archives and screened at festivals, not because it's good, but because it perfectly captures the absurd side of 60s B-movies. Party Beach might not scare anyone, but it proves how far producers would go to lure kids into theaters with a bizarre genre mashup. She-Devils on Wheels, 1968. If you thought biker movies were all leather jackets and grizzled outlaws, Herschel Gordon Lewis had other plans. She-Devils on Wheels puts an all-girl biker gang front and center, and they're as ruthless as any of the men. They ride into towns, humiliate local guys, and dish out brutal punishments to anyone who crosses them. It's messy, rough, and exactly the kind of film that played to rowdy midnight crowds. Lewis, best known as the godfather of gore, stepped away from blood-soaked horror just long enough to shoot this grindhouse curio. The gang, called the Man-Eaters, are played mostly by non-professional actors, which only adds to the rawness. The bikes roar, the insults fly, and the film never pretends to be polished. When it premiered, it shocked audiences who weren't used to seeing women in roles this aggressive. Mainstream critics called it trash, but on the drive-in circuit, it was a sensation. Motorcycle clubs reportedly showed up in full gear just to see how Hollywood was portraying their lifestyle, and many walked out laughing at how cartoonish it looked. Still, She-Devils on Wheels deserves credit for breaking new ground. It flipped the script on biker films by putting women in charge, even if the execution was as clunky as a broken carburetor. Today, it's remembered less as a great film and more as a bold, outrageous experiment in exploitation cinema. It may be silly, but it's impossible to forget. The Brain That Wouldn't Die, 1962. This one has one of the most infamous setups in all of B-movie history. A scientist crashes his car, killing his fiancée, but instead of letting her go, he saves her head and keeps it alive in a pan of bubbling chemicals while he searches for a replacement body. Yes, the entire movie revolves around a severed head sitting on a table, whispering bitter lines at her would-be savior. Shot in 1959 but not released until 1962, it immediately earned a reputation for its shocking imagery. The talking head effects were surprisingly effective for the budget, and the script leaned into the grotesque premise. Audiences couldn't look away, even when the acting veered into unintentional comedy. The film's climax, featuring a monster locked away in the lab that finally breaks loose, became legendary in grindhouse circles. The creature design is laughable now, but in dark theaters it had just enough shock value to make audiences gasp. Critics panned it naturally, calling it tasteless junk. But like many films on this list, its reputation grew over time. It became a staple of late-night horror TV and eventually a favorite target for Mystery Science Theater 3000. The Brain That Wouldn't Die is exactly what a 60s B-movie should be. Outrageous premise, cheap effects, and a concept so wild you can't believe anyone ever thought it would work. And yet, somehow, it does. Astro Zombies, 1968. When a movie stars John Carradine, features Tura Satana from Faster, Pussycat, Kill, Kill, and still looks like it was shot in someone's garage, you know you're in prime B-movie territory. Astro Zombies follows a mad scientist who builds robotic creatures from stolen body parts, all while international spies and go-go dancers swirl around the plot like glitter in a snow globe. Directed by Ted V. Michaels, a man who prided himself on making movies with the weirdest premises possible, this film is the definition of bargain bin science fiction. The Astro Zombies themselves are lumbering killers with flashlights strapped to their heads, wandering through dark hallways while stabbing victims with kitchen knives. The sound effects are out of sync, the dialogue drags forever, and yet people couldn't get enough of it. Drive-in theaters ate it up because it had everything: mad science, women in flashy costumes, and Carradine looking like he was phoning in his lines between naps. Tura Satana, already infamous for her tough girl persona, steals the show as a ruthless villainess leading a gang of spies. Critics shredded it, but Michaels laughed all the way to the bank. The movie spawned sequels decades later and even inspired a Misfits punk song. It's living proof that sometimes so bad it's good is exactly the secret ingredient for cult immortality. The Creeping Terror, 1964. Here's a strong contender for the worst monster movie ever made. The Creeping Terror features one of the most laughable creatures in film history, basically a giant moving shag carpet with dangling tongues. It's supposed to be an alien consuming people, but most of the time the actors have to crawl into its mouth on purpose just to make it look like they're being eaten. Directed by Vic Savage under mysterious circumstances, the movie's production was as chaotic as the final product. The original soundtrack was lost, so most of the dialogue is replaced with endless narration explaining what's happening on screen. The effect is surreal, almost like a parody, except they were completely serious. Despite all this, The Creeping Terror became a drive-in staple, often shown on double bills where audiences came specifically to laugh at it. It developed a cult following on late-night TV in the 70s and 80s, with viewers marveling at how such a ridiculous film ever got finished. What's wild is that even in its failure, it captures the heart of B-movie culture. The monster looks terrible, the pacing is a disaster, but it's unforgettable. People still talk about it 6 decades later, which is more than you can say for most polished Hollywood films of the time. Eegah, 1962. Palm Springs, dune buggies, a teenage love story, and a 7-foot caveman who just doesn't belong in the modern world. That's Eegah, starring Richard Kiel, years before he became famous as Jaws in the James Bond films. Here, Kiel plays a prehistoric giant discovered by a group of California teens, and the results are every bit as ridiculous as they sound. The movie was directed by Arch Hall Sr., who also cast his son, Arch Hall Jr., in the lead. Hall Jr. had already played deranged killers in other low-budget flicks, but here he was, meant to be the charming teen hero. Let's just say his awkward crooning with a guitar on desert cliffs didn't exactly win hearts. The film is infamous for its clumsy editing, cheesy dialogue, and bizarre attempts at mixing teen comedy with caveman fantasy. In one scene, Kiel's towering caveman mutters "Eegah" repeatedly while wandering through a suburban bathroom, and it's so awkward it has to be seen to be believed. Though critics called it an embarrassment, it became a cult classic through Mystery Science Theater 3000, where it was roasted to perfection. Today, Eegah is a time capsule of 60s B-movie excess, cheap production, family vanity projects, and a concept so bad it turned into legend. The Dead One, 1961. Shot entirely in New Orleans, The Dead One is often credited as one of the very first American films to feature zombies in full color. And unlike the later Romero classics, this one drips with Southern Gothic vibes and voodoo-inspired horror. It's the story of a plantation cursed by an old family ritual, unleashing a zombie servant who stalks the grounds at night. Directed by Barry Mahon, better known for pumping out exploitation flicks, The Dead One feels slow and creaky by today's standards. But what sets it apart is its eerie use of real Louisiana locations, cemeteries, plantations, and foggy swamps. The atmosphere is thick, even if the acting often stumbles. When it was released, it barely made a ripple outside of regional theaters. Too odd for mainstream audiences and too tame for the growing grindhouse crowd, it slipped into obscurity. But collectors eventually rediscovered it, praising it as a fascinating early attempt at zombie cinema before Night of the Living Dead changed the rules. It's not a great film by any stretch, but as a piece of horror history, The Dead One earns its place. Sometimes the films that fail hardest are the ones that accidentally pave the way for bigger revolutions. The Devil's Hand, 1961. Suburban America meets creepy cults in The Devil's Hand. Robert Alda plays an ordinary man who stumbles onto a secret society operating behind the facade of a doll shop. Each doll represents a victim, and when the cult leader pokes or twists the doll, the real person suffers. It's one of those premises that sounds like a cheap Twilight Zone knockoff, and that's exactly how it plays. The movie is full of awkward pacing, wooden acting, and laughable special effects, but the atmosphere has a strange charm. The doll shop setting is unnerving, and the cult ceremonies have just enough mystery to keep things interesting. Neil Hamilton, who later became Commissioner Gordon on the 1960s Batman series, hams it up as the cult leader, clearly enjoying every over-the-top line. Though barely noticed in its day, The Devil's Hand survived through late-night television broadcasts, where horror fans embraced its campy weirdness. Collectors often point to it as a prime example of how even the cheapest films of the 60s tried to cash in on America's fascination with the uncanny. It might not scare you, but it will make you smile at how hard it tries. And that, in a way, is the perfect definition of a 1960s B-movie. So there you have it, 15 B-movies from the 1960s that prove you don't need Hollywood gloss to leave a mark. Some were terrifying, some hilarious, and some so bizarre they defy explanation. But they all share one thing. They dared to be different in an era obsessed with conformity. Which one surprised you the most? Drop your pick in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe for more deep dives into cinema's strangest forgotten corners. The next rabbit hole might be even weirder.